3 of the course, and this week we are diving into some of the meat and potatoes of the material, so to speak, moving from more abstract and general ideas to more specific concepts that you will begin to find in your day-to-day life, and that will begin to, I hope, expand your understanding of systems theories. This week we are covering cybernetics theory in particular. And so this is part one of two parts of first order cybernetics, where we are going to be covering specific concepts that you will be reading about in your books and writing about in your papers. So let's go ahead and dive in and see what we are going to be learning this week. To begin with, cybernetics comes from the Greek word cyber, which has to do with steering, or one that handles an oar. This was coined by Wiener around 1948. He's credited with naming the observed ability of systems to steer themselves. So systems' abilities to naturally govern their own processes, to naturally regulate themselves, to naturally direct themselves. Cybernetics is basically, as we are going to be talking about it in this class, the refinement of theories that are used to study the processes by which systems self-regulate, as I just mentioned. So for our purposes, that's really what we're talking about. And of course, we're talking about this because we tend to think of human systems in the same way. They self-regulate, they steer themselves, and we're interested in finding out the means by which they do so. Before cybernetics theory, there was great emphasis on the difference between man and machine. After cybernetic theory was introduced, the focus shifted to their similarities. So I'm hopeful that by the end of this and next week's lectures and readings, you have some understanding about how machines and humans, both humans as individual systems and humans in their interactions with one another in larger systems, operate similarly. In cybernetic theory, the machine is used as a metaphor for how humans operate. So try to hold on to that idea of this as a metaphor throughout the time that we talk about first order cybernetics. There's not a one-to-one comparison between machines and human beings, and it's not to say that humans are the same as machines, obviously, but the metaphor can be carried over so that when we look at how machines operate, when we look at how machines as systems self-regulate and steer themselves, we can begin to understand the ways in which humans, in their relationships with each other and in their functioning as distinct systems, operate in similar ways. So cybernetics can be thought of as the study of feedback mechanisms in self-regulating systems, as well as a tendency to maintain stability by using information about its own performance as feedback to influence future performance. So these notions, the notion of feedback, the notion of self-regulation, and the notion of maintaining stability are hallmark features of cybernetic systems. So keep these in mind. When you begin to start to distinguish cybernetics from other systems theories, these are the concepts that I want you to refer back to, that of feedback, self-regulation, and the maintenance of stability. So let's talk a little bit more about that, and as I begin to introduce some of the specific concepts that come out of first order cybernetics, you can begin to explore how these three notions, again, feedback, self-regulation, and maintenance of stability, appear throughout the concepts. First order cybernetics first emerged from communication engineering and computer sciences as a method to understand the principles of how systems work and how they are regulated. So lucky you, unbeknownst to you, you registered for a course that's taking you so far outside of the realm of what you probably anticipated studying, but systems theories is really a hybrid of ideas that are multidisciplinary, that go across fields of study, and these are two particular fields of study that have lent important ideas to us that help us to conceptualize a systemic view of human behavior and of human relationships. In this particular instance, communication engineering and computer sciences have lent us those ideas. The focus in first-order cybernetics is placed on structure or patterns of organization within systems. It's also a focus on control, which happens through feedback cycles, and a focus on universal laws that explain what governs all systems. So I'll say that again. In cybernetics, we understand the patterns of organization among systems by looking at the way that the systems are structured. So how do the parts of the system fit with one another? What are the patterns in the way that the system is set up and organized? How does the system self-regulate? What are the feedback cycles? What are the processes by which information is generated from the system and fed back into the system to produce other processes and outcomes? In other words, how is the system's functioning controlled? And lastly, what are the universal laws that explain what governs all systems, whether we're looking at mechanical systems, information systems, or human systems? So that's a sort of theoretical overview of cybernetics. In first order cybernetics, which is what we're covering this week and next week, the unit of concern is the system rather than the individual, right? So we already know from last week that in the systemic epistemology, in the systemic view of the world, we're zooming out the lens. We're no longer focused just on an individual out of context, right? But on the system of which that individual is a part. And we can be looking at any one system of many in which that individual is participating. So the unit of concern is the system rather than the individual. And we take into consideration the larger context. Now here's the important point to note, particularly because later on in the term we're going to be talking about second order cybernetics. So to avoid confusion, get this clear from the start. In first order cybernetics, the observer remains outside the system that is being observed. Within the framework of first order cybernetics, the therapist works as an observer of systems, right, observing from the outside, and attempts to understand what is going on within a family from a frame of reference that does not include him or herself. Okay, so when we talk about first order cybernetics, we're talking about cybernetics and all of the things I've described on the previous slides. But the important distinction is the point of reference and the position of the observer. The observer is positioned and considered outside of the system. So the observer's observations are just about the system, okay, from a distanced position. The observer is not part of the system, and the observer does not consider his or her participation or interaction with the system. Okay? That may become a little bit clearer when we talk about second order cybernetics, but hold on to the concept for now. And if you're still curious and have questions about it, jot a note down to yourself and put the question up on the discussion board so we can begin to have a conversation about it that may make this clearer for you before we move forward with the concepts. So one of the first important ideas that comes out of a cybernetic systems theory and a cybernetics approach is that in first order cybernetics, systems must be understood in context. Now this, of course, is not new to you. We've talked about this in the previous weeks. Bekvar and Bekvar, the authors of one of your texts, have a pretty useful and articulate way of describing this. They say, from a systems perspective, we understand that change equals a change in context. We recognize that all behavior makes sense or is logical within a given context. The goal is the creation of a new context within which the desired behaviors become logical and behaviors not desired no longer fit. So take a look at the second sentence there after the ellipse. The goal is the creation of a new context. And in that context, the desired behaviors become logical and behaviors that are not desired no longer fit. Okay, so think about the importance of context as it's being described by Bekvar and Bekvar when it comes to our work as therapists or as coaches. The changes that we're trying to create are not changes in personality. They're not changes in symptoms. They're not changes in diagnoses. They're not even really changes in level of functioning. They're changes in context. And these changes in context make it so that the desired behaviors make sense and the undesirable behaviors no longer make sense. So the process of change, therapeutically speaking, when we think about therapy that's drawn out of a cybernetic frame of thinking, the process of change is a process of creating new contexts. Now, context, to expand a little bit further on the concept, although of course we've already begun to cover it in previous weeks, can be defined as emergent wholes in groups of two or more related parts, right? And groups of two or more related parts is another way of saying systems, right? So the emergent wholes, not just looking at the isolated parts, but as the wholes, and as the concept of non-summativity, which Hansen talked about in one of your readings last week, as the concept of non-summativity tells us, this idea, the emergent wholes idea, right, is more than just the sum of the individual parts. Context can also be defined as the set of facts or circumstances that surround a situation or event. So one example is when we talk about the historical context, right? The prevailing condition that influences the performance or the outcome of a process is another way of talking about context. And finally, environment is another shorthand word for context, another way of referring to context, the totality of the surrounding conditions for any behavior or any event. As we know by now, everything about a relationship or system will be understood differently depending on the context within which it is observed. Right? For example, your relationship with one of your family members is likely to be different if you are observed at a family picnic versus at a funeral. Right? Your relationship with a coworker is going to be understood very differently in the workplace setting versus happy hour on Friday after you get out of work. Almost so that if someone were observing from the outside the system containing you and your coworker, or the system containing you and your family member, the understanding of that observer would be quite different depending on the context in which they are observing you. Almost so that the person could even get two completely different ideas about that relationship, and perhaps define the relationship completely differently according to the context. Right? And so I want you to give some thought to the implications this has for our work with clients and the importance of context then in understanding our clients and their behavior and the patterns of interaction that they're describing to us and that we're witnessing within the context of our office. Contrast that with perhaps the other contexts in which these behaviors or interactions might be taking place. Systems thinkers believe that all behavior makes sense or is logical within a given context. You know this already, but it does bear repeating. And as I've mentioned in previous lectures and also in my responses to you in the discussion board, our responsibility as systems thinkers is to get curious about how behavior makes sense or is logical within a given context. And so we ask questions about context, so that we can better understand the behaviors of our clients or the perceptions of our clients or the ways that our client systems function. And then, of course, our job is to shift the context or introduce new contexts or new contextual understandings that make it so that the desired behaviors make sense and the behavior that's undesirable no longer makes sense. So let's look at an example of another place where context really makes a difference. Stepping outside for just a moment of the framework of cybernetics and human systems and human behavior, and looking at spoken word and how much context plays a role in that, spoken and written word. And I'm only going to use one example. I'm only going to talk about one example from this website, but I found it to be really clever, and so I invite you to read through all of them. So this is a website that talks about, what's the word that they use here? Contextomy, there we go. How something that's said might take on a completely different meaning when viewed out of the original context versus when it's understood within the original context. So here's an example of a quote from John Adams. "This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it." Right? So the way that this quote is sometimes cited and understood by people is as an argument against religion. So sometimes people use this quote to argue against religion and appeal Adams' authority, or use the quote as evidence that the founding fathers were opposed to religion, right? And if you read this sentence as it's written, just on its own, you would probably come to the same conclusion, right? It sounds like he's saying the world would be better if there were no religion in it. So as a founding father, it might appear that he was making the point that the world, should exist in the absence of religion in its optimal state. But let's look at the original context in which this quote was made. Adams actually said, "20 times in the course of my late reading have I been upon the point of breaking out, 'This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it.' But in this exclamation I should have been as fanatical as Bryant or Cleverly. Without religion, this world would be something not fit to be mentioned in polite company. I mean hell." So as they say here, the contextomy is in quotation marks in Adams' letter, which is an important part of the context, since it shows that Adams is not endorsing that sentiment, but in fact he's rejecting it. So he was making the complete opposite point of what this quote has been taken to mean. So you see here the importance of context. Now that was just one example of how context makes a difference in understanding, and we can see all kinds of examples of this, and feel free, if you think of some, to put them up on the discussion board. Let's get back to our lecture. Another concept that's a hallmark of first-order cybernetics is the concept of open and closed systems. One way to understand how families operate is to examine the nature of the boundary set between the family and other systems. The more input family members accept, the more open the family system. The less input accepted, the more closed it is. So you see here how this has to do with boundaries. A family that has more permeable boundaries, right, that lets more information into the system, is said to be more open. In families in which the boundaries are more rigid, are more firm and impermeable, less input, less information is let into the system, and therefore the system is described as being more closed. Now, neither one of these extremes is considered optimal. It's no more healthy for a family to be open than it is for the family to be closed. Either one of those extremes can lead to dysfunction in the family. A system that is too open takes the risk of losing its identity as a distinct system, right? Because if the boundaries are too flexible, if the boundaries are too open, it's hard to distinguish that system as unique and as whole apart from other systems. On the contrary, a system that's too closed is cut off from other systems and closed to opportunities for positive change that would be stimulated by information entering the system. And families shift, let me go back, families shift in their open and closedness throughout the life cycle of a family. One of the things that I've noticed in my work as a therapist is that in times of family trauma, or in times of when there's a family secret, the family tends to become more closed, accepting less input, accepting less information from outside of the system. And when different family members participate in different systems outside of the family system, you will also see pushes toward more openness or more closeness. For example, when a child in the family becomes a teenager and starts to spend more time with other friends, with other systems, other family systems, right? The family systems of their friends, or the system at school, or other systems that they begin to participate in, they may begin to try to open the family system by introducing input, introducing perhaps change, inviting their parents to see things differently, to change their rules, right? Or to do things differently based on what they're learning that other systems do. So there's a push toward more openness, as one member of the system may want more flexibility or change within their own family system. I hope that that makes sense. So families are not fixed in their level of openness or closeness, is the point that I'm trying to make. Depending on what might be going on for the system as a whole, or what might be going on for any of the particular members of the system, the family may shift to being more open or more closed. And again, the optimal point, right, is somewhere between the two extremes. A family that's flexible enough to be open and let in information, right, but also not so open that it loses its identity. Another really important concept within first order cybernetics is that of linear causality linear causality or cause and effect versus circular causality or recursion, right? And you read about this in your Bekvar and Bekvar text this week. So let's expand on it a little bit. First, let's talk about linear causality or cause and effect. This is the concept that an action or event will produce a certain response to the action in the form of another event. Thus, there is a cause and effect relationship between the action and the event, right? This is not new to us, cause and effect. We've learned it before in many different contexts, and we refer to it all the time, and we think about it all the time, right? If I kick a ball, my action, the kicking, will produce a certain response to the action in the form of another event, in this case, the ball moving. Thus, there is a cause and effect relationship between my kicking the ball and the ball moving, between my action and the event that happens afterward. Some characteristics of cause and effect are that it's a single perspective, right? We're looking at it in just one way. First A happens, and then B happens. And this is a unidirectional perspective, moving in just one direction. And when it comes to looking at cause and effect in human relationships, it introduces the possibility for blaming. So here's an example that shows how this is the case. So A is the cause. B is the effect in this example. So the cause here is the wife nags, and the effect, the husband withdraws. Right? So first A happens, first the wife nags, and then B happens, the husband withdraws. Right? So this is one single perspective on the event. The event is wife nagging, husband withdrawing, right? This is only one perspective of that interaction, and it's a unidirectional perspective. It moves only in one direction. Wife nags, then husband withdraws. When we look at this cause and effect relationship between the wife's nagging and the husband withdrawing, it's easy for us to assign blame, right? So who would we blame likely in this case? Probably the wife, right? The wife nags, and because the wife nags, the husband withdraws. So it's easy to look at this unidirectional single perspective of this interaction and say, if only the wife would stop nagging, the husband would stop withdrawing, right? So the wife is responsible for the husband withdrawing. She's to blame for his behavior. And if we remove the cause, her nagging, we won't have the same effect, right? So that's the linear or cause and effect perspective. Now let's contrast that perspective with the perspective within first order cybernetics, which is one of circular causality also known as recursion. So a definition of circular causality, or recursion, is a common situation in complex systems wherein an action is controlled or affected by its own outcome or result. Now, when I talk about complex systems in this definition, I'm talking about systems that have several interconnected causes and effects. When I talk about common, I'm talking about mutually shared with no differentiating characteristics. The systems that we're referring to consist of many diverse and autonomous but interrelated and interdependent components or parts that are linked through many dense interconnections. Complex systems cannot be described by a single rule, and their characteristics are not reducible to one level of description. A family, or even a subsystem of a family, is one such complex system that consists of diverse and autonomous but interrelated and interdependent components. Now, in the definition, when it talks about interconnected causes and effects, what it refers to is many different causes and effects, that are interrelated and interdependent and thus influence others in the group in some way. So this is a very, very complex and dense definition. But what it's basically saying is circular causality is a quality of complex systems which consist of many diverse and interconnected but autonomous parts in which an action is controlled or affected by its own outcome or result. So whatever the outcome or result is feeds back into the system and produces another action. Circular causality refers to a reciprocity in the interactional cycle or patterns of behavior. We're going to go back to the same example that I used when talking about linear causality. So when we talk about patterns of behavior, what we're talking about here are the rules of interaction between the husband and the wife. So there's a reciprocity in the interactional cycle. What the husband does influences what the wife does, which then influences what the husband does, which then influences what the wife does, and on and on and on in this reciprocal, interactive, patterned process. So some characteristics of circular causality is that it can be viewed from multiple perspectives. It takes into account multiple perspectives and understandings of the interaction, versus the linear perspective, which takes only one view of the interaction. In the circular causality view, it's impossible to determine which behavior happened first, so we don't talk about the interactions or behaviors as a matter of cause and effect. And because we don't do that, it's impossible to assign blame to any one party. We see both parties as participating in a recursive, circularly causal process. So let's take the example of the husband and wife that we talked about when looking at linear causality, and let's apply it here to circular causality. This is what it would look like. The more the husband withdraws, the more the wife nags. The more the wife nags, the more the husband withdraws, and on and on and on. And you see how each of these behaviors influences the other in a reciprocal process that repeats itself and goes in a circle, feeding back on itself. Think about linear causality as going in a line from left to right. Circular causality goes in a circle. Let me go back. I thought I had another slide on this. So you remember the arrow here from left to right. So now take that interaction, wife nags, husband withdraws, and continue it going in a circle. Husband withdraws, then wife nags, then husband withdraws, then wife nags, then husband withdraws, then wife nags. So you see that the linear perspective is one segment of the circular perspective. Does that make sense? So again, we're back to isolating parts versus looking at the big picture. This is not to say that circular causality or recursion is more correct than linear causality or cause and effect. There's a place for both. But when it comes to understanding human interactions, it's useful to look at how the behavior of each participant in the system influences the behavior of the other. And looking at it in terms of this recursive reciprocal feedback process helps us to move away from assigning blame and simply look at process and interrupting processes that are not working. Remember that systemic therapists are not interested in pathologizing clients. And we're always interested in zooming out the lens and looking at process and looking at interaction. So cause and effect just sort of segments or cuts off a bigger picture understanding of what's actually happening. So once again, we're zooming out the lens. And the cool thing about looking at patterns of interaction in terms of recursion is that we can interrupt that cycle at any point and the whole thing is going to fall in on itself. So we don't have to go in on the wife and tell her, if only you would stop nagging, then your husband would stop withdrawing. We could look at the process of interaction and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm noticing that the more you withdraw, husband, the more that it makes your wife, get nervous and start to nag, right? And start to come after you. And the more she does that, the more it makes you kind of shut down and withdraw and pull away. And then she sees you doing that and it just makes her crazy and she just wants to understand what's going on with you and just wants to talk to you. So she comes after you again and you feel like she's nagging and then you withdraw and on and on and on the two of you go. So I wonder what would happen if, and then from that point you can introduce any number of possibilities that include both the wife and the husband, that introduce new behaviors or new approaches, new variations that are going to interrupt the cycle. And neither one of the two parties gets blamed. They're both seen as participants, and therefore the possibility for change, the possibility for doing it differently, is shared equally among them. Nobody gets defensive, nobody feels put on the spot, and both people are given the freedom and the responsibility to do things differently. So we're now in systemic territory with this concept. And I hope that that example helps you to see how useful it is to think in terms of the big picture again, to think in terms of wholes rather than isolated parts when it comes to interactional processes between people or between clients, if you will. Okay, so those are just a few of the concepts that we're going to be covering for first order cybernetics. I invite you to go back to your readings and look up the concepts from this week's lecture and read through those again so that you can meld what you heard here today with what you read and hopefully really refine and solidify your understanding. Any questions that remain, any curiosities that remain can be discussed in the discussion board. Just go ahead and post those with your responses to the question or as a separate thread as you've been doing. Great job so far, by the way, with the discussion board. I'm really enjoying our conversations and our dialogues. As promised, at the end of every lecture, I'm going to be posting the concepts for the week so that you can begin to keep a ledger of concepts that you have learned. That way, when you go to write your short papers or your final paper, you know exactly what concepts to write about and illustrate with your examples. So this week we talked about cybernetics, of course. We looked at the concept of context and system. We talked about open and closed systems. And finally, we talked about circular causality versus cause and effect. As I mentioned, this was part 1 of 2. So next week we're going to pick up with other concepts that are characteristic of first-order cybernetics. And as I mentioned, later on in the trimester, we're going to contrast our understanding of first-order cybernetics with second-order cybernetics. So exciting stuff. The concepts in this class will be building on themselves and building on each other. So please, as I mentioned before, don't let yourself stay stuck if any of these concepts are confusing. Post something about it in the discussion board and let's get to talking about it. So I will see you all there, and I will see you back here next week for week 4. Enjoy your Labor Day, and we will talk soon.